Even though we can't choose where we come from, we can choose how to live. But for some, that choice comes at a price far heavier than anyone should bear. Heshu Yones was a soul born between two worlds, and her decision to live freely, to love openly, to dream boldly, bled into a deep, fatal wound that stirred the hearts of strangers, lovers, friends, and a nation that would never forget her name. Her roots ran deep, watered by centuries of tradition, of discipline, sacrifice, and silent endurance. She had been taught to walk with humility, to speak with caution, to live by codes written long before she arrived. Her upbringing taught her to survive, to preserve, and to honor. Her environment, loud, vibrant, and full of life, taught her something else. That friendship is freedom, that expression is strength, that laughter doesn't need permission, that love isn't something to fear. And so Heshu, bright, curious, alive, began to stretch toward the light, like a flower breaking through stone. She began to move to a rhythm the people from where she came from never played, a rhythm of possibility, a melody of choice. But what happens when roots refuse to let go? What happens when the soil you were planted in punishes you for growing? This is not just a story of culture clashing with freedom. It's not merely a tale of love defying boundaries or a household torn by belief. This is the quiet devastation of someone caught between the past and the future. A person who tried to live with both in hand and who paid with everything for believing that was possible. This is the story of Heshu Yones, a person who chose to live and whose choice changed everything. Welcome to the Crime Series. Before we begin, do us a quick favor. Drop your location and the time you're watching this in the comments. We want to know where you're tuning in from, because these stories matter everywhere. Like this video, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. In the early 2000s, the multicultural fabric of the United Kingdom was undergoing a quiet transformation. Families fleeing war, persecution, and dictatorship were finding new homes in British suburbs, each household bringing with them histories shaped by displacement and hope. For many, the UK represented a sanctuary, a place where survival could finally give way to rebuilding, where the traumas of yesterday might be traded for the freedoms of tomorrow. Among these arrivals was the Yones family, ethnic Kurds from Iraq who had escaped the suffocating repression of Saddam Hussein's regime. Years of fear, political targeting, and civil unrest had pushed them to the edge. Their journey to the UK was not a leap of ambition, but a flight from survival. And when they finally settled in Acton, a suburb of West London, they did so with the quiet, tentative optimism shared by many refugees. The hope that maybe here things would finally be different. At the heart of this family was Heshu Yones, born in 1986. She was the second eldest of the children, a position that often brings both responsibility and scrutiny. But Heshu bore with grace. Described by teachers as brilliant, expressive, and full of energy, she radiated a warmth that drew people in. At William Morris Academy, where she studied, Heshu didn't just pass through the system. She stood out. She participated. She asked questions. She formed friendships across cultural and religious lines, eager to understand the world around her. Like many teenagers raised in multicultural cities, she was constantly absorbing language, fashion, music, ideas. She dressed like her peers, listened to popular artists, and flirted with the freedoms that seemed to define British adolescence. In many ways, she was becoming a mirror of the environment she was growing up in. Yet this transformation was not just external. Beneath the layers of Western influence was a deeper evolution. Heshu was beginning to redefine what identity meant for someone like her. She was not rejecting her heritage. On the contrary, she seemed to carry it with awareness. But she also believed, naively or not, that tradition and self-expression could coexist, that she could honor her family and still live her truth, that one didn't have to cancel out the other. But this vision of balance wasn't shared by everyone, and certainly not by her father. Abdallah Yones was a man whose worldview had been forged in fire. In Iraq, he had been a supporter of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, PUK, a political faction that stood in open resistance against Saddam Hussein's iron grip. For this, he had been hunted, threatened, and ultimately forced into exile. When he arrived in Britain, he brought with him the scars of that past, memories soaked in loss, fear, and an unrelenting sense of duty to protect what was left of his family. Yet Britain, though safer, was a strange land. Abdallah struggled with the language, with the bureaucracy, with finding consistent work. The streets were unfamiliar, the customs perplexing, the values often contradictory to everything he had known. And perhaps most unsettling of all was watching his children, particularly his daughters, embrace this new world with ease. It wasn't just about clothes or music. It was the casual defiance, the friendships with boys, the independence. These weren't just teenage habits in Abdallah's eyes, they were threats to the moral and cultural order he had fought to preserve. To outsiders, he may have seemed rigid, even cruel. But to himself, and to many in his community, he was doing what any honorable father would do, guarding the family's reputation, preserving dignity, holding the line. He was in every way a man torn between two worlds. In public, he tried to adapt, shuffling between jobs, smiling politely when spoken to in English. But in private, he watched helplessly as the traditions he held sacred began to erode under the pressure of modern life. His children were growing into people he barely recognized. And Heshu, with her radiance and independence, became both a source of pride and a focus of fear. As his grip on the familiar loosened, Abdallah clung more tightly to what he knew, the strict codes of family honor, especially as they related to the behavior of women. In his cultural lens, a daughter's reputation was everything. It defined not only her future, but the family's standing in the eyes of the community. If a daughter stepped out of line, even innocently, even unknowingly, it was the father who bore the shame. And in Abdallah's world, shame was heavier than death. He began to notice changes in Heshu. There were signs she was socializing in ways he considered inappropriate, going out without permission, speaking freely to boys, and even wearing subtle makeup to school. These acts, relatively harmless in the context of British adolescence, triggered deep anxiety in him. To Abdallah, it wasn't rebellion, it was dishonor. He reportedly grew increasingly controlling and suspicious. Friends of Heshu would later reveal that her home life became restrictive, with rising tension between father and daughter. She was pulled between a desire for autonomy and the looming threat of punishment for stepping beyond the line her father had drawn. The situation intensified when Abdallah discovered that Heshu was allegedly in a romantic relationship. She had a boyfriend who was a Lebanese Christian boy from college. Despite being well-meaning and respectful, his existence challenged everything Abdallah believed in. Amidst the restrictions, Heshu found comfort in the relationship that later became the focus of so much scrutiny. When she had begun seeing Nizam al-Khoury, their relationship was tender and young. They met at school, exchanged notes, and spent time together in ways many youngsters often do, carefully and secretly. Yet in the cultural context of her home, this was not a harmless romance. To Abdallah, such a relationship was a serious transgression. Not only was it unsanctioned and secretive, but the boy was also of a different faith. For a father raised in a conservative Kurdish society, this was a dangerous combination. In his worldview, a daughter's reputation was fragile and easily destroyed, and her actions, no matter how innocent they may seem, reflected directly on the family's standing. And because of that great fact, the atmosphere in the home reportedly grew even more volatile. Arguments turned into confrontations, the rules tightened further. Heshu's attempts to assert herself were met with rage and despair. This was not an isolated tale. Abdallah had connections to a Kurdish community in London, people who, in some cases, held similar values and might have echoed his sense of cultural anxiety. Whispered rumors from within this network that added to his distress. In some traditional circles, even the suggestion that a daughter was acting Western could be enough to stain a family's reputation. Abdallah, already fragile from years of displacement and struggle, likely internalized this pressure to a severe degree. To him, he was, by all outward appearances, a protective father. He had endured a great deal of hardship to bring his family to Britain. But over time, protection turned into control. His world being governed by deeply rooted cultural codes, especially around the behavior of women and daughters, caused him to make a fatal choice. Abdallah began monitoring her phone use and restricted her movements outside the home. According to reports, she was grounded for extended periods and subjected to verbal and physical punishments when she defied instructions. Throughout all this, however, Heshu remained hopeful for a life beyond the boundaries imposed on her. She began to imagine an escape. Some friends recall her talking about the future: university, travel, perhaps even moving away to live independently. These weren't wild fantasies, but realistic dreams for a girl who excelled academically and had the social confidence to thrive. Yet each day at home made those dreams feel more distant. In her final weeks, she made at least one documented attempt to run away. Before doing so, she wrote a letter, part apology, part explanation, part farewell. It was written with the emotional honesty of a teenager, bearing signs of both affection and pain. She made light of her father's strictness, even referencing his physical strength in a joking manner, but the subtext was clear. She needed freedom, and she felt she could not find it at home. The letter read thus: "Bye, Dad. Sorry I was so much trouble. Me and you will probably never understand each other, but I'm sorry I wasn't what you wanted, but there's some things you can't change. Hey, for an older man, you have a good strong punch and kick. I hope you enjoyed testing your strength on me. It was fun being on the receiving end. Well done, Heshu Yones." It was not a letter of defiance. It was not a dramatic farewell written in rage. It was the quiet voice of someone exhausted, someone who had tried for far too long to fit into two incompatible worlds. Heshu had packed a few of her belongings, left the note behind, and disappeared into the streets of London, hoping that somewhere out there freedom could be found, that she might live on her own terms, away from the shadows that had darkened her once happy home. But the world is not always kind to those who flee, especially when they are still tethered by fear, by love, and by lack of options. For all her courage, Heshu was still young, with limited access to shelter, money, and legal support. Eventually, under pressure, perhaps from guilt, perhaps from a phone call with her mother, perhaps from the crushing realization that she couldn't escape without help, Heshu returned home. Some reports suggest that she missed her younger siblings and hoped her father's rage had cooled. Others believe she was promised leniency, maybe even forgiveness. But whatever hope she carried when she stepped back into that house, it soon began to fade, because things had changed. Her departure had not softened her father's stance. If anything, it had hardened it. Abdallah Yones had been humiliated, not only by what he saw as a betrayal, but by whispers within the community. Rumors had begun to circulate. Anonymous letters were sent to his workplace. One particularly cruel message, written in Kurdish, accused his daughter of bringing shame to the family. In cultures where reputation is currency, this kind of gossip is not idle, it is corrosive. And for Abdallah, it was unbearable. By the time Heshu returned, the air in the home had thickened with suspicion. There was no reunion, no healing. There was only assessment, scrutiny. Her father's mind was now consumed with one question: had she dishonored the family while she was away? And so, in a moment that remains among the darkest in this story, Abdallah reportedly forced Heshu to undergo a virginity test, a degrading and invasive act rooted in patriarchal control and pseudoscience. The results, though medically meaningless in determining anything about consent or worth, were interpreted by her father as a final damning verdict. He allegedly believed she had failed. And in that belief, his shame calcified into something more dangerous: obsession. From that point forward, Abdallah's moods grew erratic and severe. Family members described him as a man unraveling, swinging between long silences and bursts of anger, pacing the flat, speaking in fragments about what people would say, what she had done, and how there was no way back. He began isolating himself even from his wife and children. To outsiders, this might have looked like a private family crisis. A grieving father struggling to raise a teenage daughter in a foreign land. But inside that home, the ground was shifting. The distance between father and daughter had become an unbridgeable chasm. And with each day that passed, the space filled not with understanding or reconciliation, but with dread. Heshu, once hopeful that the storm would pass, must have begun to sense the danger growing in the silence. She tried to live as normally as possible, going to school, speaking to her boyfriend discreetly, journaling her feelings, but the walls around her were closing in. Conversations became confrontations. Trust became surveillance. Every look, every word, every movement in the flat was weighed down by unspoken tension. Fortunately, at the time, the UK was slowly waking up to the phenomenon of so-called honor-based violence, a term used to describe crimes committed in the name of preserving family or community reputation. Such acts, while not confined to any one religion or nationality, were often carried out within tightly knit diaspora communities, struggling with cultural transitions. Authorities, schools, and social services were still learning how to intervene. But in the case of Heshu Yonez, no one did so in time. A friend later recounted that Heshu once arrived at school with bruises, injuries she tried to hide beneath her uniform. On another occasion, she shared that she had been locked inside the house for talking to a boy. Despite this, she rarely complained in a way that would draw institutional attention. The attack occurred in the late hours of the evening. If this story has moved you so far, don't let it stop here. Like this video to help it reach more people. Subscribe for more real, powerful stories that shine a light on hidden truths. And if you believe no one should suffer in silence, share this video. Someone out there might need it more than you know. On that quiet night on October 12, 2002, the hum of the surrounding neighborhood had long faded into the background. A dull noise of traffic, television sets, and passing conversations on Bartholomew Road in Acton, West London. Inside the Yonez family home, however, the silence was heavier, thicker. It wasn't the peaceful kind that settles after a family meal or the kind that follows a long day. This was the tense, unnatural quiet that only exists when emotions have nowhere else to go. While the rest of the family slept, or perhaps pretended to, Abdallah barged into his daughter's bathroom, where she barricaded herself talking to her lover, carrying a kitchen knife with him. There were no cries heard by neighbors, no doors slammed, no furniture overturned. The horror of what followed unfolded in silence. The blade, later described by investigators as a common household knife, was wielded with terrifying intent. Heshu was stabbed multiple times, 11 wounds in total. She attempted to escape, evidence later showed, but was unable to get far. It was later determined that the injuries included deep wounds to her neck and chest. She had likely turned, attempted to shield herself, perhaps even tried to reason with her father in her final moments. But there was no reprieve. The force used was brutal. And when the attack was over, she lay motionless on the floor, barely a full-grown adult, full of dreams, her life extinguished not by a stranger or an accident, but by the very person who meant to protect her. There were no public cries for help from Heshu, no reports that brought police or social services to intervene in a meaningful way. And therein lay one of the great tragedies, not only of Heshu's story, but of many similar cases. Cultural sensitivity, fear of stereotyping, and a lack of institutional training in handling honor-based abuse meant that warning signs often went unnoticed or unaddressed. What followed was not a cover-up, nor a frantic escape. It was something more chilling. A suicide attempt. Yes, after Abdallah used the knife on his eldest daughter, he used it on himself. Perhaps as an act of retribution or remorse, no one could tell. Regardless, as he slit his throat, he threw himself over the balcony from Heshu's bedroom. A neighbor discovered a body, severely injured on his neck, and called for help. And soon enough, both an ambulance and the police were alerted. While granted the permission, the police were in the Yonez household, questioning and searching through every corner. Then they discovered something even more horrifying, another body. A young soul, not fully grown, with several stab wounds and a broken phone beside her. Her family identifies the body as their second child, Heshu Yonez. Questions arise, investigations begin, secrets unfold. And despite the desperate attempts of Tanya, her mother, to deny the crime of her husband, stating that he had been going through a lot of challenge, and her elder brother's attempt to water down the incident, allegedly claiming that Heshu was probably killed by members of the Al-Qaeda, the evidence screamed otherwise, hence the police were adamant in their interrogation. During the months of Abdallah's recuperation, police officers never stopped flooding in the hospital. Members of the family and of the Kurdish community stood in the way, but regardless, the cops were unrelenting. It became major news. The Kurdish community was under pressure due to its reluctance to testify, and the news of them discouraging witnesses from coming forward. But at long last, after his several months of recovery, at approximately 11 a.m., a few days before his trial, Abdallah walked into the police station and calmly told the desk sergeant that he had killed his daughter. He had offered a full confession in detail. And he spoke in terms of duty, as though he believed he had done something necessary to right a wrong, however morally and legally reprehensible it was. It was this rationalization that chilled many to the core. Here was a man who did not act out of spontaneous rage, but out of a deeply ingrained belief system, one that placed family honor above his daughter's life. According to officers present, he appeared resigned, even slightly relieved. He expressed sorrow, not for the act itself, but for what had led him to it. "She shamed me," he reportedly told them. In that one sentence, the motive, the mindset, and the moral distortion were laid bare. In his defense, he did nothing wrong. He protected his family's honor. And soon enough, the forensic teams, after carefully documenting the scene, gathering evidence, and piecing together the final moments of Heshu's life, confirmed Abdallah's statement. It became clear that although there had been signs of trouble, no one had anticipated this level of violence. The murder of Heshu Yonez sent shockwaves through London and beyond. In the days that followed, news of the crime made headlines, not just because of the brutality of the act, but because of its underlying motive. This was not a case of domestic violence in the traditional sense. It was something more insidious. The public, many hearing the term honor killing for the first time, struggled to understand how such a concept could exist in a modern, multicultural Britain. Law enforcement officials, legal experts, and community leaders began to speak out. Many expressed horror not only at the act itself, but at the cultural norms that had allowed such a mentality to persist unchallenged. While Britain had long prided itself on diversity and cultural tolerance, the murder of Heshu Yonez forced a difficult conversation. Where does cultural respect end, and where does complicity begin? In the aftermath, social services and local authorities began reviewing their handling of similar cases. Could more have been done? Were there missed opportunities to intervene? Although there had been no formal reports made by Heshu about abuse, some felt that the warning signs, her bruises, her isolation, her known conflicts at home, should have raised alarms. There was a growing awareness that honor-based violence often hides in plain sight, masked by silence and fear. As investigators prepared the case against Abdallah Yonez, they gathered testimony from friends, school staff, and family members. Each person added a piece to the puzzle, helping build a picture not only of what happened that night, but of the culture of fear that preceded it. And yet, even as the case moved toward prosecution, many struggled with the same haunting question. Could this tragedy have been prevented? For the time being, all that remained was grief. Grief for a girl who had dreams and friendships, who loved and was loved, and who wanted, above all, the chance to live freely. Her death marked more than just the end of a life. It exposed a hidden crisis unfolding quietly in the margins of British society. The case of Abdallah Yonez was set to challenge not only the legal system, but also public perception of justice, in a society wrestling with complex questions of cultural identity, integration, and the limits of tolerance. As the legal proceedings moved forward in early 2003, the murder of Heshu Yonez had already ignited nationwide debate. But inside the courtroom, the focus returned to the evidence. methodical, impartial, and bound by law. The proceedings began at the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court, where the weight of Britain's most serious crimes are heard. Prosecutors presented their case with measured clarity. They outlined the timeline of events, the forensic findings, and most critically, the admission of the crime by Abdallah Yones himself. His confession left no ambiguity as to who committed the murder. The question now lay in the why and how the court should respond to a motive anchored not in spontaneity or mental illness, but in ideology. During the initial hearings, Abdallah sat in the dock without outbursts, interruptions, or protests. His demeanor was, by all accounts, poised, composed. Disturbingly so. He had initially entered a not guilty plea, a formality that allowed the full facts of the case to be heard in court. But this procedural step did not change the strength of the prosecution's case. Instead, it underscored a deeper legal issue: whether cultural motivation would be used to explain, if not excuse, the act. The Crown Prosecution Service made clear that this was not a case of sudden provocation or manslaughter. It was, they argued, premeditated murder. The evidence supported this. The act had been carried out in the quiet hours of the evening, using a weapon fetched deliberately from the kitchen. Heshu was attacked while in her bathroom, a location that spoke to both her vulnerability and the calculated nature of the crime. There was no immediate threat to Abdallah, no weapon in Heshu's hands, not a fight to defend himself. It was, in legal terms, a cold act of lethal intent. What added complexity to the trial, however, was the defendant's own narrative. Through his legal counsel, Abdallah did not dispute the events, but sought to contextualize them. His lawyers referenced cultural values, the pressures of assimilation, and the psychological distress caused by his perception of his daughter's behavior. They did not deny the horror of what had occurred. Instead, they portrayed it as the tragic consequence of a man trapped between two worlds, a traditional Kurdish upbringing colliding violently with modern Western norms. This defense, while not seeking to exonerate, did seek to mitigate. The court was asked to consider Abdallah's state of mind at the time of the murder. His barrister argued that he had become obsessed with the idea that Heshu's relationship had ruined the family's reputation. They spoke of a man socially isolated, emotionally overwhelmed, and clinging to a crumbling framework of honor that gave him a distorted sense of duty. The prosecution responded firmly. They did not seek to criminalize a culture, but to uphold the rule of law. Britain, they argued, is a country where no tradition justifies the taking of life, where honor, however defined, must never be weighed against human rights, especially the rights of women and children. The murder of Heshu Yones, they contended, was not a product of culture, but of control, and it was essential that the court send a clear message: no one is above the law, regardless of background, beliefs, or personal circumstances. Witnesses were called not just to verify facts, but to paint a fuller picture of Heshu's life. School staff, close friends, and social workers provided insight into her character, her aspirations, and the quiet courage with which she had endured an increasingly difficult home life. These testimonies did not dwell on graphic details. Instead, they honored her memory by highlighting her resilience, how she had navigated cultural boundaries without rejecting her family, how she had sought to carve out her identity without confrontation. Perhaps the most poignant evidence came in the form of Heshu's letter. It was read aloud in court, its tone gentle, humorous, and heartbreakingly aware of the dangers she faced. It stood in stark contrast to the accusations made against her. She had not sought rebellion for rebellion's sake. She had sought freedom with dignity. For the jury, the letter served not only as a window into her inner world, but as a reminder of what had been lost. As the trial progressed, public interest remained high. Media coverage was cautious but persistent. Commentators debated the implications of the case, often straddling a fine line between cultural critique and sensationalism. Activists working against gender-based violence seized the moment to call for greater education, better resources, and a more robust legal response to honor-based abuse. Community leaders, particularly from British Kurdish and Middle Eastern backgrounds, were called upon to speak out. Many did, condemning the act unequivocally while also urging greater understanding of the pressures faced by migrant families. Inside the courtroom, the final days of testimony were heavy with emotion, but restrained in tone. The judge, aware of the case's broader implications, reminded the jury of their duty to decide based on the facts and the law, not politics, not public opinion, and not personal feeling. In August 2003, Abdallah Yones changed his plea to guilty. It was a moment that brought a quiet but profound shift to the courtroom. There would be no jury verdict, no final summation by barristers, just the acknowledgement of guilt and the sentencing that would follow. The judge, in delivering his remarks, was clear and direct. He acknowledged the defendant's remorse but made no concessions to cultural justification. He described the murder as an appalling crime carried out against a defenseless youngster. The sentence? Life imprisonment with a minimum term of 14 years. Though the legal outcome provided closure in a formal sense, for many, the emotional reckoning had only just begun. The case set a precedent in British courts. It was among the first high-profile convictions explicitly identified as an honor-based killing. But it also left lingering questions. How many others like Heshu remained unheard? How could such violence be identified and prevented earlier? And what responsibility did society bear in allowing the warning signs to be missed? In the aftermath of the trial, government bodies began reassessing how they addressed honor-based violence. Specialist units were formed within the police. Training programs were introduced for educators, social workers, and legal professionals. And most importantly, voices like Heshu's were amplified, her story becoming a catalyst for awareness and reform. Heshu's school, William Morris Academy, was among the first places to publicly commemorate her life. Former teachers and classmates, shaken but determined, took steps to ensure her memory would not fade into the anonymous statistics of gendered violence. Quiet spaces for reflection were created, safeguarding protocols were reviewed. Discussions that had once been avoided about culture, gender, and safety were now taking place with new urgency. One teacher, who had taught Heshu in her final year, described how she had often balanced confidence with caution. She excelled in literature, showed interest in journalism, and hoped to one day become a writer or a broadcaster. In student-led assemblies months after her death, classmates read aloud pieces written by Heshu, essays, journal entries, and poems. These were not only testaments to her talent, but also windows into a life interrupted just as it was beginning to take shape. Outside the school walls, her case catalyzed institutional change. By 2004, the UK government had begun to engage more directly with the issue of honor-based abuse. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office launched the Forced Marriage Unit in collaboration with the Home Office, tasked with identifying victims, providing international support, and guiding legal processes. While forced marriage and honor-based violence were not identical, they were often intertwined, and both operated in the shadows of family secrecy and social pressure. In these early years, much of the work was reactive, but Heshu's case underscored the need for a more proactive, preventive approach. Non-governmental organizations like Karma Nirvana, founded by survivor Jasvinder Sanghera, began to see an increase in outreach. Perhaps the most significant impact, however, was in the cultural conversation that emerged, slowly and not without resistance. In British Kurdish, South Asian, Middle Eastern, and North African communities across the UK, a generational dialogue began to take shape. Parents who had once remained silent on the subject of honor killings were now being asked by their children to explain what honor truly meant, and why it had come to be associated with control, shame, and violence. Young women, especially second-generation immigrants, began speaking more openly about their experiences navigating two worlds, one anchored in tradition, the other in individual freedom. These conversations were not easy. Many families struggled to reconcile deeply held cultural values with the changing landscape of British social norms. And through all this, the name Heshu Yones remained not just as a symbol of loss, but as a touchstone for transformation. Her family, shattered by her death, remained largely out of the public eye. Public records indicate that some members moved out of the London area, seeking privacy in the wake of both trauma and attention. No statements were released in the years that followed, and while their silence was respected, it also served as a poignant reminder. The impact of such a crime does not end with a conviction. It lives on, in grief, in guilt, and in the spaces left behind. Each year, on the anniversary of her death, human rights groups quietly mark the date. Some light candles, others post messages on social media. The remembrance is often understated, but its meaning is profound. One girl's voice, silenced in 2002, continues to echo through conversations about justice, gender, and the meaning of belonging. Heshu Yones did not live long enough to see the change her story inspired. But the shift is undeniable. Through legal reforms, educational programs, and a growing chorus of survivors, her memory has become part of a wider movement, one that insists on dignity without condition and safety without compromise. Her story, ultimately, is not just one of tragedy. It is one of awakening. Let Heshu's story not just be remembered as a tragedy. Let it be a turning point, a reason to educate, to intervene, and to protect the next Heshu before it's too late. Share this video. Talk about honor-based abuse. Break the silence, because honor should never cost a life. If you found this story important, give it a like, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe for more real stories that deserve to be heard. Together, we can raise awareness, one voice, one story at a time.